So a couple of years ago, I don't know if anybody gets these OCI reports. This is Outpost International, I believe is the title of it. Looks something like this. They're kind of fun to read. And as I was reading through it, there was an article that talked about year-end reflection. And this should probably come as no surprise to anybody who knows me. I like to set goals, I like to work on things, and I'm not necessarily a person who sets a New Year's resolution, although I do like to, over the last couple of years, sit down and reflect on the previous year and kind of set some goals for the next year. And this is how some of the stuff, my long-range planning, works for me, and it works pretty well. One of the examples of that, we did Week of Prayer. I always, beginning of the year, take a look at when do we want to do that, when do we need to start recording by, what's going to be our topic, so we kind of have an idea and running so it doesn't get away from me or surprise me. It probably doesn't surprise any of you that I would do something like that. So this really appealed to me. There was some questions in here to look back over your year. And there were questions like, what were you doing this time last year? Who were you with? What were you hoping for in the previous year? Also questions about what's been the hardest part of the year? What's been surprising? Who's blessed you? What have you learned about God this year? Several different reflective questions. So I decided, along with some of the other end of the year reflection things that I do, that I was going to write out the answers to these questions. So I'm going through, following the questions out. And I get to the last section, and it says, okay, after you've done all this reflecting, take a look at, are there some action steps that you might need to take? Do you need to write a note of thanks? Is there forgiveness to be extended or sought? Something that you need to leave behind? And as I'm kind of writing through, I get to the forgiveness one, and I'm like, I don't really think of myself as somebody that holds grudges. But I sit with that for a second. Is there any forgiveness that I need to extend or that needs to be sought? And an incident comes to my mind. And that incident happened earlier in that year, quite a bit of ways. And it surprised me that question brought that to my mind. And I thought, oh, I didn't know that I was even still thinking about that. And it was a very small incident compared to other things that could happen. And it was something where someone slighted me in some way. And even at the time, while it hurt my feelings and I was a little bit disappointed in their actions, I also sort of knew, given the maturity level, the person that I was dealing with there, I was like, well, I'm sure they don't really quite understand that, that was probably hurtful. And I didn't feel like I could say anything at that time. So it surprised me that months later, when I'm doing this year-end reflection, that I'm like, I did not realize that I still was harboring some unforgiveness towards this person. Now, in my case, because the person is not here, and they are elsewhere, and it's not somebody I know really well, I didn't feel the need to go back and have a conversation with them and try to figure it out and hash it out. Because number one, I was like, they probably have totally forgotten this has ever happened. Because it probably didn't affect them the way that it affected me. And so I just sat with it and brought it to God and said, okay, here's what happened, Lord. I'm obviously still holding some piece of this with me, and I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to let that go. I'm going to forgive that person, and made it as a choice. And so some of you may have had experiences like that. Some people, maybe you have bigger experiences that come to mind where you needed to extend forgiveness or forgiveness needed to be sought. So this is the question that Peter brings up, bringing us to Matthew 18, 22 and 21. So Peter asks this. It says, then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times. And Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times, or 70 times 7. And the answer here needs to be looked at that Jesus gives, because here's the context. To understand Peter's question, we have to understand where is this coming from? What's happening here in this story? So in Peter's day, the rabbis had a lot of rules for things. which if we look at the rabbis at that time, that will not surprise us. And one of the rules, or one of the things that they had, was that 3 was kind of the limit of forgiveness. You forgave somebody 3 times. That was kind of the rule, if you will, that they had put out. So thinking about that in context, when Peter says, well, should I forgive them up to 7 times? He's thinking he's being very generous, because not only is he saying, double the amount of what the rabbis suggest plus 1, so we get 7, but also, too, just in terms of biblical numbers have some significance, too. 7 also represents this idea of perfection as well. And so he thinks to himself, like, I'm being very generous if I'm forgiving somebody 7 times. But Jesus' response has nothing to do with numbers. As Peter is looking at this and going, well, okay, the rabbis say 3, and I think it should be 7. What do you think, Jesus? Jesus, like, this is not about numbers. He does give a number in there, but he's not meaning for them to go, I want you to then count up and check box how many times and keep track of that. That's not what he says. I'm going to borrow from Christ Object Lessons, because I love the wording here. This is why it says, but Christ taught that we are never to become weary of forgiving. So he's giving this gigantic number, again, not to have him check boxes, but he's giving a gigantic number to say we should be forgiving. The point is to be forgiving and not have a checkbox attached to that. And Jesus, in his style, of course, tags on this parable. So this is right after Peter asked, how many times should we forgive? 7 times. And Jesus gives him this long number, but then also gives him the story to illustrate the point. So this is starting in verse 23 of Matthew 18. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that had been sold, all of them had to be sold to repay the debt. At this time, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay you back everything. The servant's master took pity on him and canceled the debt and let him go. So we're going to pause there for a second. There's more to the story. It doesn't end there, but let's just take a moment to look at what's happening in this story. Now remember, the parables have meanings underneath them. And so we can take a good look, knowing from the other parables, and often the king represents who in a parable like this, oftentimes, right? God, Christ. So we can say, okay, we have the king, God, Jesus, who comes to settle his accounts with his servants. People like you and me, if you will. And again, I'm going to borrow from Christ Object Lessons on this to give us some additional ideas. It says Christ is represented by the king, who moved with compassion forgave the debt of his servant. Man, who we were just talking, we are the servant, was under the condemnation of the broken law. He could not save himself, and for this reason Christ came to this world, clothed with divinity, with humanity, and gave his life, the just for the unjust. He gave himself for our sins, and to every soul he freely offers the blood-bought pardon. With the Lord there is mercy, and with him is plenteous redemption, which is Psalms 137. So what we see here in the first part of the story is a couple of different things. The pardon that the servant receives represents that forgiveness, that divine forgiveness that God gives to all who ask. We also see, too, that it is not just a partial. It's not he gives him this pardon and it's only just a little piece. The entire debt is canceled. We see the compassion of the king. It says, because he had compassion on the servant. So we see the king's compassion towards others, which should, and we're going to dig into this a little further, outflow from those of us who receive compassion. This is 1 John 4:11. Dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. So we see the compassion of the king towards his servant. An outflowing of compassion is the hopes But what we do recognize, and we're going to see really quickly, is the servant doesn't understand his helpless state. He doesn't understand that this is, if you will, freely given, doesn't understand the compassion that's given to him. And how do we know that he doesn't understand this? Because immediately following this, we see this action. This is Matthew 18:28. But when the servant went out, so he has just been completely forgiven, debts canceled, he's free to go, nobody has to go to debtor's prison, and he comes out, and he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. "Pay back what you owe me," he demanded. So this parable makes a distinction of how much was owed where, for a reason. So this parable is called the unmerciful servant. So the unmerciful servant, the one that just came out, how much did he owe? Did anybody catch how much he owed? Yeah, he owed that like 10,000 bags of gold. A lot. He owed a lot. And he comes out and he's shaking down his fellow servant who owes him 100 silver coins. So already there's just disparity here in this. You're already getting a sense just from hearing that number that this servant here didn't owe nearly as much as this servant owed to the king. And he grabs the guy and starts choking him out and "Pay me back what you owe me," immediately demanding from this man. And this is represented so well in this quote. "So there are many who hope by their own works to merit God's favor. They do not realize their helplessness. They do not accept the grace of God as a free gift, but are trying to build themselves up in self-righteousness." So in other words, somehow this servant, when he's the unmerciful servant, is in there talking with the king, and he's down on his knees and he's begging the king to forgive him. Somehow he's got it in his head that he has somehow earned this. I have begged, I have asked for it, whatever, and he's free and he's moved on. He does not extend this forward. We just see this, right? He comes immediately out and reenacts almost the same thing, except for the king did not choke out the unmerciful servant, with this other servant. And what we see very quickly is he misses the attitude that the king was trying to portray or hoping to see from this servant. He misses these two things. He misses the humbleness that should have come, and he misses the part where he should have been broken in understanding this wasn't something that he had done. And I don't know if anybody has ever been forgiven a debt, anybody's ever taken out student loans, or paid back debt. That feeling when that is gone, when you're out of debt, whatever that may be, it's a wonderful feeling. And it's a feeling that I would hope for anybody who is dealing with a burden of debt. I would never wish that on somebody else to have that burden of debt. And you know what I'm talking about. And there's such a gratitude when you finish that out, or when sometimes people are able to do loan forgiveness programs for their jobs and stuff like that. There should be gratitude coming from you that I am no longer under that weight. And an understanding of what other people go through when they're also under that weight. And we don't see that at all with this unmerciful servant. We don't see an attitude or an understanding of what his fellow servant, who owes him significantly less than what he owed, no compassion for this man. And we see, as the parable goes on, the following. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, "Be patient with me and I will pay you back," right? The exact same words that this unmerciful servant just said to the king, this fellow servant says to him. But the unmerciful servant, he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. So he executes a sentence that he just avoided himself on this other servant. Said, "Nope, you got to go in jail until you can pay that." But who is outraged by this? When the other servants saw what had happened, so people around them see this and know, wow, this guy was just forgiven all this debt was canceled. They knew that this had happened. and they see the servant go out and how ungracious he is, they're outraged. They are outraged. They're like, wow, how is this possible? And they go to the king. They go to their master. And they tell him everything that happened. We just saw, you just forgave this guy's debt. He just went out and nabbed this other guy and stuck him in prison. Isn't this exactly what... This doesn't make sense. And the master called that servant up, called him to account, calls him in, says, you wicked servant, I canceled how much? All the debt of yours because you begged me to. Here's the punchline. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay it all back. This is how your heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother and sister from your heart. And that's how Jesus responds to Peter's question about should we be keeping check boxes? And what is the end of this? It's some hard words for some of us. This is how the Heavenly Father is going to treat you unless you forgive from where? Right? In other words, unless it's a true experience. Not saying just because I know that I should forgive, that's a good place to start. You should have some knowledge that should be something to do. But he's saying it needs to come from in here. It needs to be an experience internally. And as I said, the punchline was what? He says, I had mercy on you. Shouldn't you have mercy on other people around you? So you might have, after reading this parable, you might have some questions. And these are some questions that either I have or I just kind of thought of, what are some things that people would ask? There's plenty of questions that could be asked that might come up here that you might ask about forgiveness. I think we all intellectually know, yes, we should forgive. It's a good thing to do. But there are situations that are significantly, I would say, harder than the slight that I brought up earlier at the beginning here when you're thinking about forgiveness. But here's some questions that people might have. So first question someone might have is, well, if I'm forgiven, then what's the point of obeying? Right? In other words, if I can just go out, can I just do whatever I want and just come back in and be like, okay, God, forgive me for this, thanks. What's the point? Why would I do that? If I can just do whatever I want and keep coming back in and asking him to forgive me 1,000,000 times over. How about, so do I forgive and then I just let people walk over me? Sometimes people have that misconception. They go, if I forgive that person, that just gives them license to just keep hurting me or come back and walk all over me and be a doormat. What about if I have a problem with a fellow believer, somebody else that should know better? They should know this story. What do I do then? And a very tough question, and one that I hear from people oftentimes in the work that I do is there forgiveness for abuse? What do you do in a situation like that? Do we forgive? So we do not have time to give extensive answers, but I wanted to point us in the right direction for some answers to these questions. And the first one, we're going to use the Bible, of course, for this. Is from 1 John 2:5, in answer to, well, what about obeying? What's the point in obeying if we can just keep coming back in and asking for forgiveness? And it says this, but if anyone obeys his word, love for God is truly made complete in them. This is how we know we are in him. The best way I can describe an answer to this question is this. Can you think of somebody in your life that you really care about, that you love? If you love that person, would you purposely go out and do things that would hurt them repeatedly because you knew you could just come back and just ask them for forgiveness? Would you purposely do that? I'm going to say most of us would say no. So the same thing would apply with God. If we're saying, I love you, Lord, and I'm in a relationship with you, I'm not likely to go running out and doing just whatever I want and hurt you repeatedly just because I can, just because I know that you can forgive me. Right? You're going to want to do things that are helpful and loving towards that person. Same thing with that relationship with God. So what about the question about, am I just a doormat if I just say, I forgive people, they just got off and they can do whatever they want? There's a couple ways this question can be answered. I've chosen one direction. This is 1 Thessalonians 3:10. You might at first look at this and be like, how does this relate? But hopefully you'll get it. So, for even when we were with you, this is Paul, we gave you this rule: the one who is unwilling to work shall not eat. Why do I bring this one up, and what does eating have to do with this idea of forgiveness? Why I bring this up is the idea of boundaries. That when we are forgiving, we are not saying that then somebody can continue to keep hurting us and keep doing that thing over and over again. We can forgive, you can forgive, and also say, and no, this action, this behavior or whatever, or remove ourselves from the situation needs to stop. We can do that. I think sometimes people just think, well, if I just forgive them, they can just continue to do whatever. No. Bible's pretty clear. And in this particular case, it's also talking about folks who have an ability to work, who are not working, and other people are supporting this person, and they're continuing around the cycle. And Paul is saying pretty clearly, set some boundaries with the person. If they don't work, they don't eat. Please don't take that too far and mishear me, because I understand that there are people that might hear this and think, well, what about, somebody who has some physical disabilities or has some mental disabilities or whatever. I'm not talking about those situations, but you all know the types of situations I'm talking about where somebody is taking advantage repeatedly of a situation. And Paul, in this case, is making a very clear distinction. You need to set up boundaries. So in terms of fellow believers and forgiveness, yes, we should know. And this is one of my favorite things to remember when I have any kind of conflict with somebody. And you guys probably know this because this is right in that same area. This is Matthew 18, 15, 16. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 people. So in other words, if you're in a conflict with somebody, first step should be, if appropriate and it's safe to do so, to talk with that person. Like, that should be the first place that we should go, especially with fellow believers. If somebody has hurt your feelings, they've slighted you, and you're like, I need to have a convo, go and have a conversation with them. I know this does say the word sins in there. I'm using this in a broader context besides maybe somebody's doing something that we might think is like, well, unbiblical or whatever. This still, I think, is a good principle in terms of going to talk to the person first, if at all possible. And if you're having trouble creating some resolution with that, you can take some other people with you, as it says there. But mostly with our fellow believers, in the context of this question too, is that people were, especially at Paul's time too, fellow believers were taking each other to court for things repeatedly. And y'all know, I don't know what it cost then or how that all worked there. Court fees are expensive, and it's not only just about expense, but things just get ugly really fast. And so the encouragement in general, even though this is Matthew and Jesus's words here, is to try to figure out stuff among yourselves, if at all possible. And then the last one, talking about this idea of abuse. Of course, I just talked about earlier about boundaries. Boundaries fit in here too. But this is Matthew 10:16. It says, I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. And why do I mention this particular one? I mentioned this again because the idea is this, that Jesus is sending out his disciples. And he's not sending them out so that people can just walk all over them. They can do whatever. And you just let people do whatever you want to them. Like, he's asking them, right, to use, we are given common sense and given the ability to discern things. And so I think this applies even in our relationships. And I will say this very clearly. If you're in a relationship where there's physical abuse, financial abuse, sexual abuse, whatever kind of abuse, that is not God's plan for you. You can forgive that person, but it does not mean that then that person has the right to continue to hurt you or has even maybe the right to continue to be in your life. It may not be safe. So please, 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 when you hear this, you can forgive from a distance and set the boundaries. That is very appropriate. Use the wisdom that God has given you. Forgiveness is not a get out of jail free and the person can do whatever and continue to hurt you. Please don't hear that. That is not God's plan for anybody, that they should be in an abusive situation. And as we look again back at our story, we see Ellen White wraps it up with this. And this is also just tough when you think about it. Nothing can justify an unforgiving spirit. Nothing. He who is unmerciful towards others shows that he himself is not a partaker of God's pardoning grace. In God's forgiveness, the heart of the erring one is drawn close to the great heart of infinite love. The tide of divine compassion flows into the sinner's soul and from him to the souls of others. I like this quote because it reminds us that when we are forgiving towards others, we are in that mind of Christ. We are extending to others the exact same compassion, forgiveness that we've been giving. But notice that who's the one that draws that heart to them? It's not us. We're a conduit, if you will. It says God himself, right, is drawing that person together. If you've ever had an experience where you sat down and talked with somebody, your feelings had gotten hurt or whatever, and you extend forgiveness, you know that mending can be very powerful, right? That mending, and it can draw you closer together. Well, drawing closer together is God's doing, is what's here. God's doing in there. And it says that if we've been forgiven, then we should let that flow out of us to others around us. So to wrap this up, I want to remind us, number one, this forgiveness is given freely. We saw with the unmerciful servant, he did not understand that. Again, he thought that he had earned it. He worked towards it. He somehow, when he begged, that he deserved to have that. And the implication is this. If we are calling ourselves Christians, then we must also forgive others. And not just that, but with the compassion that we received from God himself. We are to extend that forgiveness. So today, I want to encourage you, take a moment, maybe later today, to reflect back on, we're in the beginning of 2024, and maybe you need to do like I did. Maybe you need to think through for that moment that question of, is there forgiveness that needs to be extended or sought? And if it is, I encourage you, and as we've just seen, is very biblical, forgive. Forgive just as Christ has forgiven us, and extend that out to our fellow believers, to those around us, whether or not they are believers. Let's forgive. Our closing song is 102 in your white book, and if you'd stand, please.